you ever thought that the person who could save $1 billion empire might be someone you pass by every day without ever once asking their name? On the night when everything collapsed, when the brightest minds were powerless, only one person stayed behind. Not out of obligation, but because she refused to watch something worth saving be abandoned. If you skip this story, you will miss the moment when an invisible human being changes everything. Ethan Walker, 46, was once the embodiment of the modern American dream. He was not born into wealth. He inherited no legacy. There was no red carpet laid out for him. Everything Ethan had come from sleepless nights, silent failures, and an almost stubborn belief that if he were skilled enough, if he worked hard enough, he would never lose. Atlas Dynamics began in a small garage on the outskirts of San Francisco. While his peers chose safety, Ethan chose risk. He bet his youth on source code, on lines of commands running through the night, on the idea that data could change the world, and he was right. 15 years later, Atlas had become a technology conglomerate worth tens of billions of dollars, providing data infrastructure for banks, hospitals, and major institutions across the United States. The name Ethan Walker appeared in newspapers, at conferences, and on power rankings. But there was one thing that never appeared in those articles. Ethan had grown accustomed to never looking down, not looking at the people passing through the hallways, not looking at the quiet faces still working after the office lights were turned off, not looking at the people he believed had nothing to do with his major decisions. That night was no different. The 52nd floor of the Atlas Dynamics building was submerged in cold white light. Outside, the city of San Francisco still glowed as if it had never known failure. Ethan stood by the glass wall, his tie loosened, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. The next morning, he would sign the largest IPO deal of his career, a milestone he had pursued for nearly a lifetime. Everything was supposed to be perfect, but Ethan did not know that. In the very moment he believed he was standing at the highest peak, life was quietly preparing its most expensive lesson for him. Not about money, not about power, but about something he had forgotten for many years. People. And in just a few more minutes, everything Ethan Walker believed to be solid would begin to crack, little by little, in silence. 11:18 p.m. The number should not have meant anything special, but for Ethan Walker, it was the moment his life began to slip off its familiar course. A small red dot blinked in the corner of the screen, then another, and another. At first, Ethan thought it was just a routine system glitch, something Atlas Dynamics had handled hundreds of times before. He straightened up, set his coffee cup down on the desk, his expression still carrying the calm of a CEO long accustomed to crises. But only seconds later, the entire screen erupted in red. Warning messages cascaded like a flood. Servers lost connection. Customer accounts were locked en masse. Data flickered and then vanished as if it had never existed. The numbers that had once been Ethan's pride now became a cold accusation. He lunged for the control console, typing so fast his fingertips went numb. No response. No access. No way back. This was not a malfunction. This was a deliberate attack. Ethan felt his chest tighten. His breathing grew heavy, not from fear, but from disbelief. Atlas had been built to withstand every external threat, and yet the system was collapsing from the inside. He looked at the clock. Only a few hours remained before the signing of a multi-billion-dollar IPO. With every passing minute, investor confidence was evaporating. With every second, 15 years of his life were being dragged deeper toward the abyss. Ethan reached for the phone to call the technical team. Then he stopped. He did not want anyone to witness this moment. Not because they lacked the ability, but because he could not bear the feeling of losing control. He sent everyone home, turned off most of the lights, left the top floor submerged in suffocating silence. Only the low hum of the air conditioning remained, along with the emotionless alerts glowing on the screens. Beyond the glass walls, San Francisco still blazed with light. The city kept moving, indifferent to the collapse of an empire. And in that moment, Ethan Walker, the man who once believed he could never lose, faced a terrifying truth for the first time. Some failures do not scream. They arrive in silence and take everything with. While Ethan Walker remained frozen in the room flooded with the red glow of warning alerts, a minimal sound slipped into the stillness. Not a chime, not a phone, but the slow roll of cartwheels across a stone floor. The sound was so faint that if the night had not been so quiet, no one might have noticed it. But tonight, it rang out clearly, like a reminder that even when an empire is collapsing, life continues to move forward in its own way. The glass door in the hallway slid open. A woman stepped inside. She wore the simple gray uniform of a night shift janitor. The rubber gloves on her hands were worn thin at the fingertips. Her hair was neatly tied back, unadorned. Pinned to her chest was a small name badge, so old the letters were nearly faded. Maya Collins. She paused when she saw that the CEO's office lights were still on. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, then quickly gave way to the familiar calm of someone accustomed to working in silence. "Sir?" Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Are you all right?" Ethan let out a quiet laugh. It carried no joy, and he no longer had the strength to hide his exhaustion. "All right," he repeated. "I'm watching 20 years of my life collapse minute by minute." Maya did not answer immediately. She took a few slow steps forward, her eyes instinctively sweeping across the screens, flashing with chaotic data. Not curious, not alarmed, just a glance, but a deep one. Then she spoke, very softly, as if afraid of shattering the silence. "This doesn't look like a routine technical error. Someone on the inside opened the door for this attack." The words made Ethan spin around. A janitor. Someone whose face he had never remembered, speaking about something his elite engineering team had not yet been able to identify. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice edged with doubt and irritation. Maya slowly removed one glove. Her hands were not delicate, but they were steady. "I used to work in cybersecurity," she said, "a long time ago." No boasting, no pleading glance for trust, just a truth laid down, calm and heavy. And in that moment, Ethan Walker suddenly realized, for years, he had learned how to see every number, but had forgotten how to see people. And the woman whom everyone in the building walked past every night might be the only person still standing between him and total collapse. Ethan Walker stood still for a few seconds, as if his brain were trying to process an entirely new piece of data, one that did not fit into any risk model he had ever built. A janitor, a woman he had never spoken to, standing in his office, talking about an internal attack. The rational part of Ethan immediately pushed back. Every instinct of a CEO trained to maintain control was screaming that this was a mistake. He had hired the best experts and paid the highest salaries, and yet now, as everything collapsed, he found himself listening to someone his own system barely acknowledged beyond a time clock entry. "Do you understand what you're saying?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully restrained. Maya did not step back. She did not step forward either. She stood there in the red glow of the warning lights and spoke slowly. "I understand perfectly. And if you hesitate any longer, the back door will be locked completely. No threat, no persuasion, just a truth spoken at precisely the right moment. Ethan turned back to the screens. Lines of data continued to vanish piece by piece as if someone were erasing the traces of an entire empire. With every passing second, he lost something he had once believed to be permanent. He knew this. If tonight failed, there would be no IPO in the morning. There would be no board. There would be no Atlas Dynamics as he had known it. And for the first time in many years, Ethan had to admit something deeply uncomfortable. He was no longer in control. He took a deep breath. "What do you need?" Ethan asked. Maya looked at him, her eyes showing no spark of victory. "Access," she replied. "Full access." The room fell into silence. It was a request Ethan had never granted to anyone, not even those closest to him. A master access card was the final boundary between order and chaos. He held the card in his hand, cold, heavier than usual. This was no longer a business decision. This was a gamble. Ethan stepped aside, clearing space at the control console. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his voice lowering. "If you're wrong..." Maya sat down and placed her hands on the keyboard. "If I'm wrong," she said softly, "then you had already lost everything." There was no way back. No plan B. In that moment, Ethan Walker did something he had avoided throughout his entire career. He handed over control to another human being, based solely on instinct and on a fragile belief that sometimes saving what matters most is not about knowing how strong you are, but about daring to admit when you need someone else. Maya Collins sat down in a chair that had never been meant for her. The wide leather chair, accustomed to billion-dollar decisions, now held a woman who had passed through this room hundreds of times, unnoticed. She placed both hands on the keyboard, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if this moment had been prepared for a long time. The first lines of code appeared. Fast, precise, not a single wasted movement. Ethan stood behind her, motionless. He said nothing, but his mind raced with questions. What if she was wrong? What if this became his final mistake? He had placed all his trust in someone whose name he hadn't even known minutes earlier. Maya paused for a moment. "There's a secondary access port," she said. "It was forgotten during the last system upgrade." Ethan frowned. He didn't remember that. "No one does," Maya continued, as if reading his thoughts. "The most dangerous things usually hide where people believe everything is already under control." She resumed typing. The chaotic streams of data began to slow. Some folders that had vanished earlier reappeared. Not a miracle, but patience and an understanding so deep it bordered on obsession. 1:30 a.m. Maya stood up. "We need to go down to the server room." They stepped into the elevator together. There was no longer any distance between the CEO and the janitor, only two people racing against time. When the steel doors opened, a wave of cold air rushed in, carrying the familiar hum of hundreds of servers operating in critical condition. Maya moved between the server racks like someone who had known this place for years. She plugged in cables, rerouted traffic, and isolated each system segment. Every action had a clear purpose. Time passed in silence. The coffee grew cold. Red warning lights blinked, then went dark. 3:07 a.m. A line of text appeared on the central screen. "System restored successfully." Ethan said nothing for a few seconds. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, trembling laugh, as if his body had finally allowed itself to breathe again. He turned to Maya. "Did we do it?" Maya nodded, exhausted but calm. "Not we," she said quietly. "It was you. You just needed someone who wouldn't give up." In that moment, Ethan Walker understood that the night had not only saved a company, it had restored something else as well. Trust. A thing he had lost a long time ago. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the towering glass panels of Atlas Dynamics headquarters, but the atmosphere inside was anything but normal. The system had been restored. The data had returned. The company was still standing. Yet no one in the building knew what had truly happened the night before. Employees whispered to one another in elevators. Mid-level managers stared at charts that had stabilized again, unable to understand how the disaster had vanished so quickly. Ethan Walker stepped out of the elevator on the 52nd floor with his usual composed demeanor, but inside he knew clearly. Everything had changed. He called an emergency meeting with the senior leadership team. The conference room was packed, tense eyes. Faces, once accustomed to making decisions by numbers, now carried undisguised anxiety. When the doors closed, Ethan did not begin with reports or reassurances as he usually would. He turned toward the door. "Before we talk about the figures," he said slowly, "I want you all to meet someone." The door opened. Maya Collins walked in. She was still wearing the same gray janitorial uniform from the night shift. No suit, no title placard, just a woman standing in the middle of a room filled with power, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. The room felt utterly silent. "It was her," Ethan continued, his voice calm but firm, "who saved Atlas Dynamics when all of us were powerless." A few stunned looks, a few sharp breaths, and then doubt surfaced. Daniel Price, the chief technology officer, folded his arms. "You're saying that a janitor accomplished what our entire technical department couldn't?" Ethan looked straight at him. No avoidance, no lengthy explanation. "Yes," he replied. "And the truth isn't always easy to hear, but it's still the truth." The room buzzed. The familiar order began to tremble. Titles, hierarchies of authority suddenly felt more fragile than ever. Ethan continued. "Effective today, Atlas will establish a new cybersecurity division, and its head will be Maya Collins. She will report directly to me. Not a proposal, not a trial, a decision." Maya lowered her head slightly, not out of humility, but as if she fully understood the weight that had just been placed on her shoulders. She knew that from this moment on, every eye in the building would follow her every step, waiting for a mistake. And Ethan, watching the subtle reactions ripple across the room, understood that he had just made the most dangerous move of his career, but also the right one. Because sometimes, to save a system that has begun to rot, we don't need to patch another surface layer. We need the courage to break the old order and rebuild from the ground up. In the days following that meeting, Atlas Dynamics appeared to have returned to its old trajectory. The servers ran smoothly. Clients were reassured. The numbers on the dashboards gradually turned green. From the outside, no one could see the seismic shock that had just torn through the company's core. But for Maya Collins, the sense of unease never left. She knew that the most dangerous attacks never end with a single strike. They leave echoes. Maya worked out of a small room adjacent to the CEO's office, not for convenience, but because Ethan wanted her to have direct access to everything. She began reviewing the entire system from the ground up. Every security layer, every access log, every minor change that could easily be overlooked. And then she saw it. A repeated pattern of access during the night. Brief windows, high-level privileges, traces erased with extreme precision, too precise to be accidental. The technical signatures were identical to the first night of the attack. Maya sat motionless in front of the screen, a chill running down her spine. It meant one thing. The person who had breached the system had never left. He was waiting for the right moment. She began tracking him in silence. No alarms, no formal investigation. Every move had to be exact because if she alerted him, he would disappear immediately. Over the following nights, the lights in Maya's office stayed on late. She took notes, cross-checked data, and reconstructed every behavioral sequence. And gradually, one name began to appear more often than any other. Daniel Price, Chief Technology Officer. The man who had opposed Ethan's decision from the very beginning. The man with enough access and enough motive. Maya didn't want to believe it. She understood too well what it felt like to be underestimated, but data does not lie. The logins, the modified privileges, the redirected files, all pointed back to a single source. At the same time, other signs began to surface. A strange text message on her phone. Don't dig any deeper. An unfamiliar car parked near her home far too many times. A small device attached beneath her car, a GPS tracker. Maya removed it and held it in her hand for a long moment. No panic, no trembling, just a heavy, suffocating silence. She brought it to Ethan's office. We're no longer dealing with data, she said quietly. We're dealing with people. Ethan stared at the device on the table, and in that moment, he understood that his decision had not ended a crisis. It had only opened a war, one in which the most dangerous enemy was the person sitting at the same conference table every day. Ethan Walker stood for a long time in front of his office window, his hand gripping a cup of cold coffee. Outside, the city continued to function as usual, familiar streets, familiar buildings, but inside him, nothing remained intact. Daniel Price was only a link in the chain. Maya Collins said it very quietly, but each word landed like stone on stone. She didn't need to explain further. Ethan understood. A single person rarely builds major conspiracies. They require the silence of others. They require complicity, disguised behind polite handshakes. And then Maya found the name neither of them wanted to see. Victoria Hale, Chief Financial Officer. The woman who had stood beside Ethan through the company's hardest years. The one who had sat with him in meetings that stretched past midnight, talking about the future of Atlas Dynamics as if it were their shared child. The data didn't surface immediately. It was buried deep, fragmented, carefully encrypted. But Maya was patient. She constructed a trap system, a flawless financial replica, realistic enough to deceive anyone who believed they were not being watched. 3 days passed in tension. On the fourth night, the system triggered an alert, an unauthorized access, executive-level privileges, an unmistakable technical signature. Victoria Hale. Ethan felt a crushing weight in his chest. Not because of the money, not because of the stock, but because of the betrayal by someone he had once considered family. He remembered old conversations, the times she spoke of loyalty, of core values. It turned out loyalty had a price. They decided to end everything that very night. The building where Victoria worked was lit up, cold and hollow. When they entered her office, Victoria showed no surprise. She sat there calmly, as if she had been waiting. "You shouldn't be here," she said to Ethan, her voice light, almost advisory. "It's because I wasn't here long enough," Ethan replied, "that this happened." Maya executed the final command. Victoria's screen froze. A warning message appeared. All transactions, all communications, all data transfers had been recorded. Victoria turned toward Maya, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her eyes. "Do you think you're a hero?" Maya answered slowly. "No. I'm just someone who refuses to stay silent." When federal agents arrived, Ethan knew that Atlas Dynamics had narrowly escaped another threat, a threat born from the most familiar faces. And in that moment, he understood a bitter truth. The most dangerous trader is not a stranger, but the one who has been beside us for so long that we forget to ask questions. The morning after the news broke, Atlas Dynamics awoke to an atmosphere unlike anything it had ever known. Financial news ran non-stop. Headlines flooded the screens. Atlas CFO arrested for corporate espionage. Investors who had been on edge held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Many believed this would be the final blow, the knife that would end an empire already wounded too deeply. But what happened afterward defied every expectation. Instead of panic selling, the market steadied. Instead of suspicion, the public began to look at Atlas differently, not as a cold, monolithic corporation, but as an organization willing to confront its own failures. Transparency, once something that existed only on paper, had become action. The company's value stabilized. Trust slowly returned. Ethan Walker watched it all in silence. He didn't celebrate. He didn't deliver grand speeches. To him, this was not a victory. It was simply the consequence of making the right choices at the most challenging moment. Meanwhile, Maya Collins quietly packed up her desk. Files were neatly stacked. The last lines of code were saved. She was exhausted, not from overwork, but from the prolonged strain that had drained every ounce of energy from her. Ethan stepped in, stopping at the doorway. "Where are you going?" he asked, unable to hide the concern in his voice. "Home," Maya smiled softly. "To sleep for a very long time. Maybe the first time I won't have to stay awake guarding a system." Ethan laughed, but there was something deeper in his eyes. He realized that during those chaotic weeks, Maya hadn't just protected the data. She had kept him from losing himself. A few days later, Ethan invited Maya down to the old basement, once Atlas's makeshift server room in its earliest years. The door opened and Maya froze. No tangled cables, no flickering lights. Instead, there was a modern research space flooded with light. On the large glass wall, words appeared clearly. The Collins Innovation Lab. "You didn't have to do this," Maya said quietly. "No," Ethan replied. "I needed to." He looked at her, his voice slow and steady. "Without you, Atlas wouldn't exist. And perhaps neither would the person I am today." Maya said nothing. She understood that this wasn't a tribute to one individual. It was a long overdue acknowledgement that an empire is only powerful when it knows how to rise again with the very people it once overlooked. Late that afternoon, Ethan Walker stood before the glass wall on the highest floor of Atlas Dynamics. The city below remained loud and hurried, as if it had never known that an empire had just passed through the fragile boundary between survival and collapse. But for Ethan, everything was different. He no longer saw the numbers running across the screens as the sole measure of success. The green and red charts, the growth forecasts, were now just tools. What truly stayed with him was the image of a woman quietly pushing a cleaning cart through the night, the one who had been there when even the most sophisticated systems had failed. Maya Collins stood beside him, her hands resting lightly on the window ledge. The lights in her eyes were not pride, but the rare calm of someone who had just done what she believed was right. Ethan broke the silence. "The first day I met you," he said slowly, "I thought you were just cleaning up my mess." Maya smiled faintly. "No," she said, I replied. "I just didn't want to see something worth saving be abandoned." The words were spoken softly, yet deeply enough for Ethan to feel a truth he had forgotten for many years. Success is not about never falling, but about knowing who lifted you when you could no longer stand. Atlas Dynamics continued to grow. Conference rooms stayed lit, new projects were launched, But somewhere within that rhythm, Ethan began to change the way he listened. He paid closer attention to the people once considered on the margins. He learned to ask names, learned to pause. And that was the real miracle. That evening, as they left the building under a light rain, Maya spoke quietly. "You know, I don't believe miracles come from the sky." Ethan looked at her. "I believe they come from people who don't give up," she continued. He nodded, smiling. "Then," Ethan said, "perhaps I've just met the greatest miracle of my life." Life doesn't always change through loud moments. It changes in silence, through the people we once failed to see. If this story made you slow down for a moment, leave a comment. Perhaps that's how we begin to see each other more clearly. And if you believe that the deepest things in life often come from the most ordinary people, join us at Deep Life Tales. We still have many stories waiting to be told.